Let's open our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Our subject this weekend, Avoiding Catastrophe in the Wilderness, is taken from this chapter. And what we're going to see there are 5 episodes in this chapter that the Apostle Paul is inspired when he writes to the Corinthians to refer them back to, that they might learn from the mistakes that Israel made in the wilderness. So, we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud in the sea, did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink." Now, I know that you were encouraged to bring a pencil this weekend. If you're into your colouring, your pencils, you'll notice there are 5 alls there, from verse 1 down to verse 4. And what we read then in verse 5 is this: "But with many of them, despite the fact that they all did what they were supposed to do," we then read, "But with many of them, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." Now that word overthrown is interesting. If you've got your pencil, circle it. Circle that word. It's the only time in the Greek that particular word is used. And it's the Greek word, and I'm certain I'm not going to say this right, but it's something like kastronoumi. All right? It's the only time this Greek word is used. A top tip for Bible study: if you come across something and it's not used, why? This word kastronoumi. What does it sound like? Catastrophe. Thank you all. Right answer. It sounds like, doesn't it, catastrophe. Okay? It's the Greek word that we get our word catastrophe from. So, God was not well pleased with some of them. There was a catastrophe in the wilderness. It was catastrophic for these people. And so, young people, the challenge for us in our wilderness journey is to avoid catastrophe. We're all on the wilderness journey. We're all on it. And we're heading to the promised land. We've got to ensure that our lives in the wilderness don't end in catastrophe, as it did, we read, for many of them. Now, what do we read? Have a look. Verse 6. "These things were for examples, to the intent that, number 1, we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Number 2, neither be idolaters, as were some of them. As it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Number 3, neither let's commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day, 23,000. Number 4, neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. And number 5, neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer." So, are you doing this with your pencil? Verse 6, should not, in verse 6, get next to that, number 1. And then every verse after, verse 7, number 2, 8, number 3, verse 9, number 4, verse 10, number 5. So the Apostle Paul is inspired to take us to 5 examples of things that happened in their wilderness journey, that the Corinthians might learn from their example. So surely, young people, this is a good thing for us to do, to go and have a look at these examples. And what we're going to do, we're going to change the titles on our program slightly, because we're going to use our exhortation tomorrow to deal with one of them too. So that the titles that we've got on our program, Study 1, who is on the Lord's side? Well, that's correct. From Study 2 onwards, it goes a bit pear-shaped. But we're going to deal with each of these 5 things, if that's okay. So come back now with that information in our mind. Come back to Exodus. where we infer from verse 1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, that of course Moses is up in the mountain. Now, have a look on the screen, and you'll notice that actually Moses goes up and down the mountain of Sinai on 7 occasions. We might think of him of going up and getting the 10 Commandments and coming back down. Actually, there are 7 occasions that he goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and so on. They're on the screen for us there. We don't have the time to leave that on the screen, but what we will do is share these slides. And I would suggest all of you make notes after the weekend. You'll take in this weekend 30-40% of what we talk about. If you're prepared to do the study afterwards, you'll learn a huge amount more. So these references show us Moses going up and down the mountain. And I want you to come to Exodus chapter 20, where we come across the 3rd time that Moses is in the mountain. And we see at the end of Exodus chapter 19, Moses has come down the mountain. That's actually the 3rd time. And when he comes down the mountain, he then tells the children of Israel the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20. Have a look. Verse 1, God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. And then he goes back into the mountain. Verse 21, we read that the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So this is now the 4th time Moses is going to go up into the mountain. And what is he told there? Have a look, verse 23. You shall not make with me gods of silver, neither shall you make gods of gold. Now I want you to note this. Moses has been told, you shall not make gods of gold. Moses has already been told the 10 Commandments. He hasn't been given them on tables yet, but he's been told them. He's told the people, you shall have no other gods before me. Don't make gods of gold. And look what else we read at the end of chapter 20. God says, verse 25, if you will make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not discovered. So they weren't allowed to make an altar with steps on it to go to it. Because if they did so, and think about what they wore in the wilderness, they wore what we would term today as dresses, wouldn't they? As tunics. And God explicitly says to them, you're not allowed to build steps up to an altar. Because you need to understand that I'm holy. And when you walk up the steps, actually, you'll be exposed. I don't want to see your nakedness, we're told. Now, we need to note these things. Do not make a god before me. Don't make gods of gold. And I don't want to see your nakedness, says God. I'm holy. Now, just come across to our chapter. Come to Exodus chapter 32. Or before you get there, come to 24. Come to 24 first. Let me show you something else before we get to our chapter that we're going to study carefully today. So in Exodus chapter 24, we see Moses once again going up into the mountain. We read verse 1. He said to Moses, come up unto Yahweh, thou and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship afar off. But Moses alone can come near to the Lord. Then we read in verse 9, then, now this is the 5th time Moses goes up into the mountain, went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. So you've got to try and picture this, that Moses and those with him, including the 70, go up into the mountain. And what did they see? They saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hands. Also they saw God, and I want you to note this phrase, and did eat and drink. Now, just make a little note in your margin. Exodus 32, verse 6. They saw God and did eat and drink. That note will become clear to us in a minute, but just note it for now. Next to the phrase eat and drink, there in Exodus 24, verse 11, put in your margin 32, 6. So there the nobles did eat and drink with God. And we notice then, verse 12, that the Lord said to Moses, come up to me in the mount. Now don't forget, they're already on the mountain. Nadab and Abihu, Moses and Aaron, 70 of the elders. So Moses is being invited higher. Do you understand? So try and picture this. The people are in the valley. They're in the camp. Moses, Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. They've gone up into the mountain. And then God says to Moses, I want you to come higher. And he and someone else go higher up into the mountain. Who is it? He goes with verse 13, Joshua, his minister. And what does he say to them? Verse 14. Moses turns round and he says to the 70, tarry ye here for us until we come again to you. Behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matters to do, let him come to them. Whatever you do, stay here. Stay on the mountain until we come back down to you. And so, verse 15, Moses goes up, right up into the top of the mountain. And he meets with God. And we read at the end of verse 18 how long he was there for. Someone shout out to me. How long was he there for? 40 days and 40 nights. Now that must have been a long time. It must have been a long time. In the other times that Moses went up and down the mountain, the other 4 occasions, he must have gone up and come back down perhaps within a week, within a few days. This 40-day period must have been a long time, because when Moses goes this time, he doesn't come down until our chapter, Exodus chapter 32. So come back to chapter 32. And now let's read verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron. So can you see? The people are fed up with waiting. How long has Moses been in the mountain for? Come on. 40 days and 40 nights. Is this the most sleepy group I've ever come across? How long was he in the mountain for? Come on, this isn't about me, it's about you. I've got to hear you, right? 40 days and 40 nights. So the people start to think, well, what's happened to him? Now, I'm going to suggest to you, it's on the screen for us here, that although in the authorized version it's translated, when the people saw that Moses delayed, Moses hasn't delayed. God is talking with Moses. There's no delay. God is there with Moses for 40 days. Really, I think that should be translated. When the people, the word saw can be translated perceived. When the people perceived that Moses, now this is interesting. This word delayed, the Hebrew word is used 109 times in Scripture. And this is the only time it's translated as the word delayed. Ordinarily, this word is translated as ashamed or shamed. And I think that perhaps what's happening here is that the people, here's our phrase, perceived that Moses was ashamed. And I just wonder that the people thought Moses had done a runner. The people thought that Moses was so ashamed of them because of their murmurings and their moanings in the wilderness that they think that Moses is ashamed enough to just run off. That is how that word is usually translated. Either way, though, in their minds, Moses has, at the very least, delayed his coming. And the result of that is that they start to take their minds back to Egypt. Now, there are huge lessons that are going to come out of our study this morning. Think carefully about the language we're using, about a leader who's gone away. And we might perceive that their coming is delayed, or they might be ashamed of us. And so our minds start to drift back to Egypt. I hope, young people, that your minds aren't in Egypt this morning, that they're really focused on the word of the living God. Now, just interestingly, we know what's going to happen, don't we? That these people are going to ask Aaron to create an image, and they make a molten calf. And it's just interesting for us to note that the only other time we come across this Hebrew word calf in the law is in Leviticus chapter 9. Just keep a marker in Exodus 32. Keep a marker here, but come forward to Leviticus chapter 9. And I want you to note two verses here in Leviticus 9. We read in verse 2 that Moses said to Aaron, take thee, notice that Moses says to Aaron, take thee a young calf for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering without blemish, and offer them before the Lord. Look at verse 8. Aaron therefore went unto the altar and slew the calf of the sin offering, which was for himself. Now, we don't know if Leviticus 9 was chronologically given before Exodus 32 or after Exodus 32. Here's our suggestion. If it was given after Exodus 32, this sin offering for Aaron would have been a reminder to him always of what went wrong when he led the people with the practice of the golden calf. Or if it was before the events of Exodus 32, Aaron should have been reminded when they start to put together a molten calf that really he should have had his mind on a sin offering that was for him, that calf of Leviticus chapter 9. It's just a little note in our margins next to Exodus 32. Now come back to Exodus 32, and we want to just look really carefully now at this chapter. We read, let's read verse 1 again, that when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron. So what's happened? Where is Aaron at this point? Is he in the valley? Give me an answer. Is he in the valley? So Aaron should have been in the mountain. He was in the mountain. So look at the language carefully. The people gathered themselves to Aaron. So obviously, we don't think that 2 million people walked halfway up the mountain, do we? But they obviously sent messengers to go up to the mountain. Now, what should Aaron have said? He should have said, shouldn't he? Go away. I've been expressly told by Moses to stay here on the mountain. What did Moses say? Tarry here until I come. But he doesn't. Look what happens. Look how it starts to unravel. The people say to Aaron, "Up, make us gods which shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Break off the golden earrings." Now, what had Moses already been told in the mountain? Whatever you do, don't make gods before me. Whatever you do, don't make gods of gold. It's going wrong, isn't it? Right? Take off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, of your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people break off the golden earrings which are in their ears, and they brought them to Aaron. And he received them at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, "These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it and made proclamation, said, "Tomorrow is going to be a feast to Yahweh." Now look at what's going so badly wrong here. The people start saying they want this molten calf. They fashioned it, and when Aaron sees this molten calf that they've made together, he says, oh no, this is going so badly wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's get an altar here, and tomorrow, he says, is going to be a feast to Yahweh. Young people, don't ever try to mix the thinking of Egypt with the things of the truth. Don't ever kid yourselves. Don't ever kid yourselves that we can tie up the molten calves in our lives with worshipping Yahweh. Far, far from it. Don't ever mix the things of Egypt with the things of the truth. We read verse 6. They rose up early on the morrow. They offered burnt offerings. Now these are the things of the law. These are the things of Yahweh. And peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink. Where have we come across that phrase before? Okay, 1 Corinthians 10, we'll go there later on. Yeah, it's there. Exodus 24. Do you remember? We noted it. We wrote in our margins. Exodus 32, verse 6. Just remind yourself, quickly, keep a finger here. Go to Exodus 24 again. Verse 11. What did they do in the mountain? Moses and the 70 elders. Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. What did they do? Verse 11. They met with God, and they, at the end of the verse, did eat and drink. And how badly this has gone wrong for Aaron. This man who was eating and drinking with the God of heaven in the mountain is now eating and drinking. All right, there are burnt offerings and peace offerings, but they're far from what they should have been. Because this is about worshipping a molten calf. And we read that the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. And if it isn't obvious, let me spell it out for us. There's all sorts of terrible sexual overtones here. This is not some ordinary eating and drinking feast. Far, far from it. The people have made themselves naked in the things that they're doing. It's a terrible thing. And young people, we need to learn the lesson. Do not allow your minds to be caught up with the things of Egypt and try to mix it in with the things of the truth. It's interesting, isn't it? Have you heard these sorts of conversations in your ecclesias? Where people start saying things like, everyone at school is laughing about the idea of us believing in a creator. Why can't we just go with the science? Because science seems to tell us that evolution's definitely true. And so what do? We can't accept evolution without God. So what do we create? We create theistic evolution. Does that make sense? We create evolution with God in it. This is what they did. They didn't simply say, let's go back to Egypt. They mixed it with the burnt offerings, the peace offerings. They said, this is a feast to Yahweh. It was not. Far, far from it. And so, if you're not already there, in Exodus 32, Moses and Joshua get wind of what's happening. And we read in verse 15 that Moses turned and went down from the mountain. And the 2 tables of the testimony were in his hand. So he's now got the 2 tables. And they're written on both their sides. On the one side and on the other side were they written. And the tables were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God, graven on the tables. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "Oh, no! There's a noise of war in the camp!" And Moses said, "It's not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it for the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear." And it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh to the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot. Now just think, Joshua thinks there's a war taking place. There's such a commotion in the camp. Moses, though, recognizes that sound because Moses spent 40 years in which country? Egypt. He knows the noise of Egypt. And as he comes down the mountain, he knows that noise is the noise of singing. It's the noise of dancing. Now, I'm sure many of you will know this, but if you don't, you must have this in your notes. That the Egyptians used to worship a calf god, a goddess Hathor. And look what we read about this particular goddess. What was she the goddess of? She was associated with, we read, joy, music, love, dance, drunkenness. That is what's taking place in the camp of Israel. What's taking place in your life? Some of you are old enough, in the world's eyes, to take part in these activities. We've got to avoid catastrophe in the wilderness. Do not get caught up with these things, the things of the world. If you want to get to the promised land, avoid catastrophe in the wilderness. Don't go near the goddess Hathor. Stay away from the gods of Egypt. Now, when we read on, and we've got to skip a bit here because of time, we read in verse 21 that Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people to thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them?" And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. You knew the people that they're set on mischief. For they said to me, make us gods which shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we didn't know what was become of him. I said to them, whosoever has any gold, let him break it off. So they gave it me, and I cast it in the fire, and then came out this calf." It's sort of hilarious, isn't it, really, right? It's the sort of thing that if I'm telling my kids off, particularly my youngest ones, who are 4, you know, "What happened, guys? What have you been doing?" "Oh, nothing, Dad. We literally just got this stuff together, we threw it in there, and then this happened." Yeah. "I didn't make the cow." It's a joke, isn't it, right? It's embarrassing. We threw it, and then out came this calf. When Moses saw, look, verse 25. that the people were naked. Do you remember what we read in Exodus chapter 20? You shall make no other gods before me. Number 1. Number 2, don't make gods of gold. Number 3, don't make steps going up to an altar, because I don't want to see your nakedness. And here they are, dancing naked before the Lord. For Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies. Now, there's some really key vocabulary here that we need to pick up on. I want you to make a note of Proverbs 29, verse 18, next to the word naked. When Moses saw that the people were naked, will you write next to that Proverbs 29, 18? Now, Proverbs 29, 18 is a great verse for all of us. I've quoted it in almost every job interview I've ever been to. They might say to me in the interview, how are you going to build a vision? Or do you think that building a vision is important? And I'll say, yes, it's of biblical importance. There's a proverb, Proverbs 29:18, that says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Now that word perish in Proverbs 29:18 is the same Hebrew word as naked in Exodus 32 verse 25. Have you got that? Yeah? So where there is no vision, the people are made naked. Now the good news is I don't say that in my job interviews, right? I don't think I get the job, right? But I do say the people perish. The show's over. If there's no vision, then we're as good as these men and women in the wilderness. What's happened to them? They've lost their vision. They've lost the vision of the promised land. And because they've lost the vision, they cast off all restraint. They're naked. They're eating, drinking, rising up to play with the gods of Egypt. So my challenge to you this morning is this. Have you got a vision? Now you'll notice on the table in front of me, there are packets of post-it notes, right? I've spent about £2,000 this week on post-it notes, right? And what I want you to do is to take these, and I want you to write something during the weekend. You can use as many as you want. There's about 1 million. And I want you to write something that you're looking forward to in the kingdom. Okay? Something that you're looking forward to in the kingdom. It can be personal to you. And I want you to take your post-it note, and there's a space just at the back behind the table in the room next to us. And I want you to shove them up on the board. And take the time during the weekend to read other people's vision. Because we talk, don't we, about wanting to be in the promised land, about wanting to be out of this wilderness and be in the land. Why do you want to be there? Why do you personally want to be in the kingdom? Note it down. Pop it up on the notice board. Let's try and build a collective vision that really helps us so that when we go away from here tomorrow, when we leave and go back to our homes, we've got a vision burning in us of why we want to get to the promised land so that we avoid catastrophe in the wilderness. We haven't got time to go there, but I want you to note Revelation 16 verse 15 in your margin, because it picks up this phrase. And that verse in Revelation is probably the most apt verse for our time in the whole of history. That particular chapter and the particular verses around it are dealing with our time in history. And we're given the warning, behold, I come as a thief. That's what it was like for the people, wasn't it? When Moses suddenly came down the mountain. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garment, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. So they're the two words we've got in our verse there. So I hope you've got next to Exodus 32:25, Revelation 16 and verse 15. Now come to Matthew 24. We'll start to wrap our thoughts up, but I want you to come to Matthew 24. Keep a marker here because we're going to come back here one more time. Matthew 24. And Matthew 24 is a very famous prophecy called the Olivet prophecy, because the Lord Jesus gave it on the Mount of Olives. And he's talking to them about, in the first instance, the events of AD 70, the Romans coming into the land. But the great lessons from it about his second coming to the earth. And so we read in verse 36, "But of that day and hour knows no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." What will people be doing? "For as in the days that were before the flood, they were," here's our phrase, "eating and drinking." So do you see? There's the phrase we've got from Exodus 32 and verse 6. You might want to note it in your margin. EX 32:6. The warning is given to us by the Lord Jesus Christ that it will be like the days of Noah, or like those men and women in the wilderness, where there's eating and drinking. We read verse 42, "Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord does come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched." Verse 44, "Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man comes." They weren't ready for Moses, were they? They thought he delayed his coming. They thought that he was ashamed of them. And so they weren't watching. They weren't ready. He came as a thief to them. Are we watching? Are we ready for the Lord Jesus Christ to come? And so we read in verse 45, "Who then is a faithful and wise servant?" Now, we don't have the time to look at this, but Moses in Scripture is spoken of as a faithful servant. So Moses here is like the faithful and wise servant. In contrast, Aaron, and of course the people, are like the evil servant. Look, verse 48. "But if that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delays his coming," that's Exodus 32:1. All right? Exodus 32, verse 1. So verse 48 of Matthew 24, Exodus 32 and verse 1. "And shall begin," verse 29, "to smite his fellow servants, and to," what do? "Eat and drink with the drunken." There they are, aren't they? With the goddess Hathor. "The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looks not for him, and in an hour when he is not aware of." And so, young people, there's a great lesson for us, isn't there? That we've got to be like the faithful servant. We've got to be willing to wait until he comes. They were told to stay on the mountain. "Tarry here till I come." They lost patience and they turned back to the things of Egypt, and it was disastrous. Come back to Exodus 32. We read in verse 26, last thoughts together. "Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, Who is on the Lord's side?" Now, That's actually, we think, probably like a military term. And in the Hebrew, we understand that there are actually just 3 words. And so Moses, as it were, stands in the camp and he shouts out, "Who? Yahweh, me." And what he means is, who is with Yahweh? Come to me. Who is on the Lord's side? And we see here the emergence of the Levites, because it's the tribe of Levi that steps out. Just look, verse 26. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And what they have to do, our time is gone, but they have to go through the camp and they have to slay and kill all those who are caught up with the gods of Egypt. And so the cry goes out to us this morning. Who? Yahweh, me. You have to think, I have to think, whose side am I on? Whose camp am I in? Am I going to be prepared to walk to Moses, to war the warfare like the Levites did, to be prepared to work in the truth? Or am I with those who really want the music, the dance, the joy, the love, the drunkenness of Egypt? If your mind is in Egypt, that's what will happen to you. Catastrophe will happen to you in this wilderness. So build your vision and set your minds on things above. Come finally back to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So why is it that the Apostle Paul is inspired to take the minds of the Corinthians back here? Well, look what he says. Verse 7, we've already read. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. But look what they were doing in Corinth. In verse 15, we see, and 16 and 17, the Apostle Paul talking to them about keeping the breaking of bread, of eating and drinking. And when they do that, they're, as it were, on the mountain, like they were in Exodus chapter 24. Do you remember when Moses, Aaron, Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders, they ate and they drank in the presence of God? And he says to them, you can't do that. And, verse 21, ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Do you see? That is Exodus 24 and Exodus 32. What Aaron did, and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders, they were happy to eat and to drink in the mountain with God. But then they did it, didn't they? With the people and the gods of Egypt, the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot do it under any circumstances. And so the great challenge for us is this. We've got 4 lessons to take away with us from this session. Number 1, don't look back. Don't go back to Egypt. We are so well blessed. We're so privileged that of all the people in the world, we've been called out of Egypt. Whatever you do, don't go back. Number 2, build your vision. Get something on those post-it notes. Build a vision of the kingdom. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Number 3, stay on the mountain. They were expressly told, stay here till I come back. And they didn't. And it had the most disastrous consequences. Make sure you stay on the mountain. And be on Yahweh's side. War the warfare for him. The cry's gone up to you this morning. Are you on the Lord's side? Who is on the Lord's side? If you want to enter into the promised land, you've got to make an answer now on whose side that you are on.